Take a look at the sheer scale of these weapons. This is an Iranian ballistic missile on display. 9 months ago, Israel hit the military-industrial complex at Parchin, destroying the planetary mixers used to blend rocket fuel. Yet missiles exactly like this one continued to arc toward Israeli cities. The previous strike left the supply chain intact because planetary mixers are essentially commercial equipment. You can source them through international intermediaries and have them running again in a matter of months. Hitting the mixers treated a symptom, leaving the true production bottleneck completely untouched. That bottleneck is the casting pit. As this diagram illustrates, a casting pit is a deep, heavily engineered concrete foundation where the actual solid rocket propellant is poured and left to cure. You can truck a new mixer in 5 months. You cannot easily truck in a massive underground foundation. It takes years of complex civil engineering to build just one. With coalition satellites catching every fresh concrete pour within hours, replacing a casting pit is physically impossible under current air supremacy. To permanently cripple the missile program, Israel had to go after the infrastructure Iran assumed would survive. Curious, but there is a massive geographical problem. This map highlights the flight path. The casting pits at Sharud and Parchin sit roughly 1,700 kilometers away from the nearest Israeli airfield. Traversing that distance means flying straight into an untouched, multi-layered air defense network deep inside Iranian territory. To break those concrete foundations, you need heavy ordnance. Look at the heavy external payloads on this F-15 Ram taking off. The mission required a joint strike force, stealth F-35 Adirs flying ahead to blind the radars, clearing a path for these heavily loaded F-15 bombers, carrying the munitions required to crack a casting pit. Reaching the target meant flying a vulnerable, fuel-constrained strike package directly into a gauntlet of lethal electronic traps. 90 minutes into the flight, the threat environment woke up. Look at the deployed dish on this Tor M1 vehicle. This is an X-band fire control radar, designed for short-range point defense. Out of nowhere, it locked directly onto the lead F-35. Against older systems, the F-35's electronic warfare suite simply floods the radar with noise. But the Tor M1 operates by violently shifting frequencies with every single pulse. By the time the system jams one channel, the radar is already transmitting on the next 3. You cannot jam a signal that refuses to sit still. Left with no electronic exit, the pilot broke hard, pulling 7 Gs into a steep dive while pumping out clouds of metallic chaff. It worked, but 8 seconds of sustained defensive maneuvering cost him 8,000 feet of altitude. Dropping down to 14,000 feet traded one lethal problem for another. At that low altitude, the jet entered the engagement envelope of the Missak-2, a shoulder-fired missile carried by ground security forces. The Missak-2 uses a dual-band infrared seeker, meaning it checks 2 separate heat wavelengths before it commits to a target. If a pilot drops traditional flares, one sensor might be fooled, but the second catches the lie and keeps tracking the jet's true heat. The pilot found himself trapped. Climb, and the Tor M1 radar locks back on. Descend, and the dual-band seekers catch his thermal signature. He had to thread a mathematically precise physical needle, staying perfectly balanced between the radar ceiling and the infrared floor to release his weapon. While the F-35s wrestled with the Tor system, the heavier bombers faced a much broader threat. Iran's massive domestically built Adir early warning radar had been transmitting since the operation began, sweeping the entire strike package. The Adir system uses VHF, or very high-frequency waves. Normal X-band radar is like shining a narrow flashlight. Stealth angles deflect the beam away into the dark. But VHF operates like a massive floodlight. The waves are so wide they bounce off the entire airframe, regardless of its specific shape. And when these waves hit the F-15s, hauling heavy external bombs and fuel tanks, their radar cross-section was 1,000 times larger than the F-35s. The VHF sweep immediately fed their location to mobile SA-65 surface-to-air missile batteries waiting in the dark along the flight corridor. The stealth advantage disappeared entirely. The heavily laden F-15 bombers were exposed on enemy scopes, and detouring around the 150-kilometer threat envelope would burn 20 minutes of fuel they mathematically did not have. Then, a 360-degree infrared camera system on the lead F-35 flagged an interceptor closing from the east. To understand exactly how they hunt, look closely at these airborne MiG-29s. This specific Iranian pilot was operating with his radar completely turned off to avoid giving away his position. Instead, he hunted purely with an infrared search and track sensor. sweeping the dark sky for the thermal bloom of a stealth jet's engine. If the F-35 pilot used his own radar, every surface-to-air battery in the corridor would see him immediately. Relying solely on passive cameras, the pilot maneuvered his jet, rotating the airframe to physically shield his hot engine exhaust from the MiG's sensor sweep. The MiG swept the exact airspace where the F-35 hovered and saw absolutely nothing. Survival in modern aerial combat requires absolute discipline over both the electromagnetic and thermal spectrums. Staying invisible is worth far more than getting the first shot off. Pushing past the interceptors, the formation finally reached the Shah-Rood military complex. Look at this satellite imagery of the desert facility. Intelligence expected 8 targets, but found 50% more industrial buildings. With limited bombs, the weapons officers triaged in real time. Shifting to a thermal view, they scanned for roofs radiating at exactly 60 degrees Celsius. That distinct thermal glow is the absolute proof of solid rocket propellant actively curing inside a hidden casting pit beneath the roof. The cool buildings were just mixers or empty storage. The glowing ones were the irreplaceable foundations. The success of the entire mission hinged on that manual, real-time interpretation of heat signatures. They had to separate the buildings you could rebuild in a month from the ones you couldn't replace in a year. Once the targets were verified, the F-15s executed their release. See this guided munition dropping away from the jet. These heavy 2,000-pound bombs utilized electro-optical seekers for terminal guidance, steering themselves through the smoke in the final seconds. As the weapons plummeted toward the complex, their seekers utilized reference images, acting exactly like facial recognition software for buildings. The bomb compares what it sees on the way down to a stored photograph, mechanically adjusting its glide path to hit the specific roof shielding the hot casting pit. The heavy penetrators punched directly through the reinforced concrete, detonating inside the casting halls. The blast crushed the metal cradles and collapsed the massive underground pits inward, vaporizing months of complex civil engineering in seconds. By ignoring the commercial machinery on the surface and obliterating the deep, slow-curing foundations beneath them, the strike physically erased Iran's ballistic missile assembly line from existence.